So I'm going to talk a little bit. I had a hard time deciding what to title this talk. And so I kind of landed on climate science, education, and communication. And so I don't have enough time to even start to crack the nut of climate and all the issues surrounding it, but we'll just use this as a jump off point. So a little bit of a launch for maybe some future discussions as well. So when I was putting this together, I thought, gosh, everywhere I look in the news, I can't turn the news on or pull the news up on my phone or look at the weather for the day without really being bombarded with lots of hot topics and concerns about climate. We've been hearing and experiencing a heat wave recently, and also just so far this in the past week, these are the top two things that I'm seeing in the news. One is that scientists are very concerned about the coral in Florida from the heat wave there, and the water being essentially like a hot tub. So that we're seeing, as well as the Atlantic jet stream potentially close to collapse. And so those are things that can bring about a little bit of anxiety and concern and confusion, and then you're wondering where you should get your information. And so that's just kind of a glimpse into some of what we're seeing in the news recently. And also, so let's take a minute and talk a bit about language and terminology. I think global warming is one of the terms that I had seen a lot, probably, you know, 15, 20 years ago. That's maybe the emerging phrase that we were starting to hear, but it's also somewhat can be tied to political controversy, or it's been politicized. Climate change seems to be the phrase that I see a lot now. That's the thing that's prominent in the news. Um, and also things like extreme weather and natural disasters. And so those are all ones that I feel like can be lumped into this climate language and climate terminology. And, here in Kentucky, we have had our fair share of disasters. And according to a FEMA report this year, Kentucky's had 31 severe storms or flood disasters declared in the past 20 years. So that's more than one a year on the average. And so it's certainly something that many of us have experienced firsthand. So we've kind of talked about those four terms, but what I want to talk about now are individually, we'll talk a little bit about climate science, climate education, and climate communication. And so the way I'm going to approach this, again, this is kind of a high level approach to these is, what are some places that we can look to for unbiased information and information that we can trust, and information that's not really trying to sell us on a particular view or a particular point. So in the academic setting, I guess we kind of think about things in terms of climate science, education, and communication. Those other four terms are certainly ones that we utilize, and are certainly ones that are all in the mix, but we're going to talk about these final three for the remainder of the talk today. So what I'm going to do is I've organized this into reliable sources of information. And so starting out with climate science, and the place I look to first and foremost is NOAA. So the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's a US government entity, and NOAA has a very robust web presence and information that's there on their website. Things that you can find there quite easily: climate summaries, historic weather data, things like record temperatures, record precipitation rates, in those extremes. So if we're really looking for some pinpointed data, that's a really good place to look. And so those summaries are there. Also important to remember, weather and climate are different. Weather is shorter term, climate is a longer term perspective. So also keep that in mind as well. So one thing that NOAA has are these climate summaries organized by state. And so this is the one for Kentucky. And the most recent is as of 2022. And I found these visualizations, and I thought these were really interesting ways to look at climate. So this is a visualization of Kentucky's temperature. And this is since 1895 to 2022. That's the span of these. And so what this says is that the red bars or the reddish pink color are warmer years and the bluish toned ones are cooler years. And so these are the departures from the average temperature from 1895 to 2022. So if we take an average of that and then we look year by year, each bar represents a year, and that represents kind of what the temperature swings have done. 1895 being on the left-hand side and then 2022 being on the right-hand side. So you can kind of see clusters of red and blue in that. And so I just thought this was a really interesting way to visualize the data. And this is information and an image that came from NOAA. Here's another one. They call this the climate stripes. And so this is another one for Kentucky and Kentucky's precipitation. And so again, this is Kentucky's annual precipitation compared to the 20th century average. So green represents wetter years, brown represents drier years. So kind of the summary for this is that temperatures in Kentucky on average have risen 0.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's less than half of the contiguous US average since the early 1900s. And our warmest consecutive 5-year interval was 2016 to 2020. Now, this year may change that a little bit as that warmest interval, but after we get that data, usually there's a year or two lag in what data is available so that scientists have been able to review it. Our rainfall, total annual precipitation exhibits an upward trend. And since 2011, we've averaged nearly 7.5 inches above long-term average. So kind of what's the takeaway from these climate summaries for Kentucky? Looks like the frequency and intensity of extreme precipitation are projected. But then at the same time, we have an increase in evaporation rates due to those rising temperatures. So what we might see is heavy precipitation and also coupled with droughts. And we won't dig any deeper into that right now, but that's just kind of a snapshot. So that's kind of that climate science perspective coming from NOAA. Now, if we look to climate education, the one place that most of us look is the IPCC. You've probably heard that in the news and or seen it in reports or in the media, and that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the IPCC was created in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program. And the whole objective of the IPCC is to provide governments with scientific information so that they can develop climate policies. So it is that UN body for assessing the science related to climate change and also looking at impacts, future risks, and making suggestions for adaptation and mitigation. And so some of the products that you might see coming from the IPCC is they have had several synthesis reports that I think we're in our 6th synthesis report right now, and they're looking at the state of the science, that what technical socioeconomic knowledge there is about climate and climate change, future risks, what are the current impacts, those kind of things. So they're looking at it from a global perspective and how do we get that information to governments so that policies can be made. And so you might see these kind of very complicated, I think, graphics sometimes. This is just a methane budget graphic, and I don't intend for you to capture all of the specific data that's here, but just know that these are the types of graphics that you might find in an IPCC report. So things that are, kind of representing the sources and sinks for greenhouse gases. So this is just one for methane in particular. And so that sometimes is really used for policy development and looking at adaptation or mitigation strategies for climate. So we'll move on over into climate communication and kind of a go-to place for us, maybe The gold standard is the Yale program on climate change communication. Um, that organization conducts research on public climate change knowledge, attitudes, policy preferences, and behavior. So this is sort of that social science perspective. So taking the natural science research and combining it with the social sciences and developing communication strategies that engage different audiences and solutions. They also develop climate opinion maps. So they do polls and surveys of the public and try to get public opinion and a snapshot of that public opinion related to climate. And so one thing you might have seen or maybe have heard about, they have something called Global Warming Six Americas. I'm not exactly sure which year this was started, but they, so they use global warming as a terminology. And now, we're wondering maybe there are some connotations to global warming, like we talked about before. That phrase has been somewhat politicized. But they've continued with that terminology just for continuity's sake. And so the six Americas that they described is that the basis is that most Americans can fall in one of these six categories in how they view climate and climate change. So you may be on one far end of the spectrum of being alarmed, and maybe a little less alarmed but concerned or cautious. And then we also have disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. So everybody, we think from their research, falls somewhere along that spectrum of how we look at climate change. They also produce products that look like this. And so this is from a recent report this spring and it's the title is "A Majority of Americans Are Worried About Harm from Environmental Problems in Their Local Area." And so on the vertical axis, you see some of those environmental problems. So extreme heat, air pollution, water pollution, droughts, agricultural pest diseases, all the way. So several of those what could be considered natural disasters, of course. And the darker green means very worried. And then toward the yellow is not at all worried. So that kind of shows you where Americans' mindsets are following. And so that's kind of as the entire US. And then one more slide about that is what do Kentuckians think? So this is just a specific question. And this is an estimated percent of adults who think global warming is happening. And this is as of 2021. So this is just a visualization of some of the research that Yale conducts. So local to Kentucky, another climate communication source is the Kentucky Climate Consortium. The Kentucky Climate Consortium is a multidisciplinary network of folks that are involved in higher education across Kentucky. It was started here with some of our faculty members at the University of Kentucky, but we have membership from all over the state. And so I've participated with KYCC as well as several of my colleagues. And we support research, teaching, and outreach related to climate. And so we're looking at all of these areas of the spectrum: climate science, climate education, and climate communication. So some of the things we've done are climate chats, and that's kind of really among the members of the consortium, but then also pairing that with some public outreach. So that's what's going on here in Kentucky. So here's a summary of what I've covered in terms of reliable sources of climate information. For climate science, I look to NOAA. NASA is another source of good information. Climate education, I would look to the IPCC. And then climate communication, the Yale program, as well as the Kentucky Climate Consortium. And, the thing to keep in mind is wherever you get your information, let's just have some basic information literacy. Here at the University of Kentucky, we, our what we stand by is research-based information. And so information literacy is extremely important to us. This is a concept that we teach our students in the classroom. We also want to remind our public audiences as well, is making sure that you know the source of the information that you're receiving and look for reputable research institutions, agencies, or organizations. Do they have a good reputation for providing objective, peer-reviewed information? And then, making sure it's research-based. Some questions to ask might be, do multiple studies have similar findings? Has the data that you're looking at been peer-reviewed? And so keeping in mind that most popular media is not peer reviewed, but it might include data from scientific studies. So always kind of look for the fine print in the information that you're consuming and making sure that it is coming from a reputable source. So that is what I've got for today. So I'll wrap